Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to do a brief presentation on the steel industry in Canada. Part of the reason why I'm doing this is I want to target United Steel Workers Union. They seem to be on a big push to kind of be anything but conservative party, and they seem to be supporting Thomas Mulcair. So I want to show you the industry as a whole, show some of the policies Mr. Mulcair is talking about, and also show how the union is contradicting their stance to what business is requiring. So here's a message from the president of the Canadian Steel Producing Association. So that includes companies like Dofasco, which don't exist anymore, but Algoma, IPSCO, all these major steel companies, also the steel processing centers like Samuel & Sons Steel. And it's a big area because if you look at steel as a whole, from flat roll steel, we basically create what we call as plates. That plate then has to be cut and transformed as part of the manufacturing process for automotive or even the steel industry. A lot of the medical fabricators in Ontario support the steel industry, which is about a $5 billion business in Ontario for manufacturing. So basically this guy is really talking about the overall view on the market itself in Canada. The steel market itself is about, he's basically talking about 13 million metric tons of steel, and he's also talking about 100,000 spin-off jobs as well as 18,000 directly employed by the steel industry. It's a big area. This just gives you an example. Now my trends are basically show you the per steel production. Now my trends might be a little off from what you're seeing with the industry trends. He may have used 2012 trends, which I show here about 13.7 billion metric tons. So you're seeing that it's sizable business here. So let's talk about key aspects here. Like everything else is part of the budget process, they have committee meetings, and the various trade associations come and present what they're kind of looking for in terms of the direction of government. And basically, if you look in here as well, they're actually applauding different things here. They're applauding that the government's going to take a really hard stance at looking at this trade remedy system in terms of the imports and exports, as well as making sure there's not any dumping happening from China into Canada. So they want to make sure they continually monitor trade policies, and they believe Harper's on the right track based on this announcement bullet point. The second point, they're talking about accelerated capital cost allowance. The NDP supports this, so I won't talk a lot about it, but it's a key area in terms of policy and depreciation in terms of the equipment write-offs. The other point here that's interesting is liquid natural gas. Harper has put in a policy to support liquid natural gas across Canada, and this is a big point of contention in BC because you've got a riding up there in British Columbia, Nathan Cullen's riding, that it is supposed to be set up for export of liquid natural gas. But Mr. Collins said very little about that. Why? Because he doesn't support anything to do with development of the natural resources area, and yet Prince Rupert as well as some other areas in BC could benefit from the liquid natural gas. Also the metal fabricators who would build tanks and pipelines and all that would benefit from this, but yet you do not hear anything from Nathan Cullen on that from the NDP's perspective. Let's talk about tax policies. Now, as a business, the steel producers would probably be looking at making sure there's not going to be enhancements to CPP, which are payroll taxes, which is being proposed by the NDP. They're going to also be talking about cap and trade. The example they use is Ontario, and basically what they've said is if you bring in a cap and trade system, that just adds cost to the whole process for us, which then adds cost to the consumers at the end of the day, right? It seems to me Mulcair doesn't seem to get it about how cap and trade systems work in terms of the cost. He also doesn't seem to get it that the point is the cap and trade system has been a failure in Europe, and yet he seems to be wanting to promote it. The other point is that he's going to do is he's going to hike corporate taxes by 1.5%. Now, most of these steel fabricators, metal fabricators and steel production in Canada are mostly medium to large size company. There aren't very many small businesses that would qualify for a corporate tax cut that Mulcair is doing, because it's only really quantifies in general as 1/3 of manufacturers. And in steel, that's not a lot of companies that would be basically producing steel. The bulk of the steel is produced by big companies, and that's something that seems to be ignored by Thomas Mulcair, and it's kind of puzzling because yet he's got the steel workers supporting him. Now, this one just talks about ORPP. I just did this as to back it up in terms of CPP because the government's going forward in Ontario with an ORPP, which is going to add cost. So if an ORPP is going to add cost, so will CPP enhancements as well, and that's why I brought that up. And if you see this point blank statement, the Manufacturer Association as well as the steel production producers do not agree that they want to see more payroll taxes. This also talks about cap and trade, that the steel producers do not support it because again it adds cost to their production cycle. So let's talk a little bit about here. This is the flyer that they're sending out to their union members. Basically in here they're talking about better pensions, better jobs. Well, how are you going to have good jobs when you've got a government like Thomas Mulcair that's coming in, doesn't support trade? He's looking at hiking taxes. He's masking things in terms of what he's going to do in terms of his corporate tax cut. But he doesn't have all angles of policy in terms of what's required in manufacturing. So it's one thing to say that he supports manufacturing, but in essence, by his comments here in terms of the salaries and everything else that's going on here, the union is not in agreement with what their business is. And yet they'll be the first one that screams when there's job cuts back or production's moved off to other areas because of the cost. And yet you're not hearing that from United Steel's workers. That's why I brought this up. This is the game plan the unions are using. They're basically pushing NDP policies, and yet they're destructive in everything that stands for in terms of benefiting their employers. So you can see that the union and the company are not on the same page.